She did not know when she stepped off that train in Billings with nothing but a carpet bag and a contract she had not signed herself that the man waiting for her had not sent for a wife. She did not know that the three children watching her from the shadows of the hallway had not slept through the night in 2 years. She did not know that before the winter was over, she would sit beside a boy who would not wake up and whisper the words that would bring him back. And she did not know that the man who had not spoken to her for 4 hours on a frozen mountain road would one day kneel in the snow and say the only words that had ever frightened him. She thought she was going west to keep house for a stranger. She had no idea she was going home. This is the story of Nora Whitfield, three brothers, and the mountain that kept them all. The wagon hit a rut in the frozen road and lurched hard to the left, and Nora Whitfield grabbed the wooden rail beside her seat with both hands and held on without making a sound. She had learned over the past 4 hours that making sounds on this particular road in this particular wagon beside this particular man was not something that would earn her anything useful. Not sympathy, not reassurance, not even a glance. The man beside her held the reins with the same unhurried grip he had held them since Billings. His hands were enormous. She had noticed that first before she noticed his height, before she noticed the hard angle of his jaw, or the way his eyes sat deep beneath the brim of his hat like two pieces of gray winter sky. His hands were the hands of a man who had never held anything that he was afraid of breaking. Calloused across the palm, scarred at the knuckles, weathered to the color of old saddle leather. They rested on the reins as though the leather were an extension of his own bones. His name was Colt Aldridge. He was 35 years old. He was a widower. He had 3 children. He was, according to the contract folded inside Nora's coat pocket, her husband. She had not yet decided what she thought about that. The road climbed steadily upward through stands of ponderosa pine that rose on both sides, like the walls of a cathedral nobody had finished building. The light came through the branches in long, pale fingers touching the snow in patches, making the world look like something between sleeping and waking. It was beautiful in the way that things are beautiful when they do not care whether you admire them or not. The mountains in the distance were the color of deep water. Montana Territory. November 1878. She had never been farther west than Indianapolis. Nora shifted slightly in her seat and looked at Colt from the edge of her vision. He had not spoken since they crossed Callaway Creek, which had been, by her best estimate, nearly 2 hours ago. Before that, he had spoken exactly 4 times since collecting her at the Billings station. He had said her name once as identification when he stepped forward from the line of 3 enormous men and looked at her the way a man looks at a horse he is deciding whether or not to buy. He had told her the wagon was ready. He had told her the drive would take most of the afternoon. And once somewhere around the 2nd hour, when she had straightened her back against a sudden gust of wind, he had said without looking at her, the past gets colder before it gets warmer. She had not known if that was a warning or a fact or something else entirely. She had said thank you. He had not responded. Now the horses moved steadily upward, and the only sounds were the creak of the wagon and the muffled percussion of iron shoes on frozen ground, and the occasional low whistle of wind through the pines. Somewhere behind them, she knew his 2 brothers were riding, Bram and Whit. She had met them on the platform and already understood in the way you understand something without being told that they were very different from each other and very different from Colt, and yet bound to one another in the particular way that men are bound when they have survived something together for a very long time. She pressed her fingers together inside her coat pockets and thought about Springfield, Illinois, and the way her father's study had smelled of pipe tobacco and old books, and she thought, do not think about that now. She had learned to give herself that instruction and obey it. She was 18 years old. She had been managing grief since she was 12. She knew how to not think about things. She looked instead at the road ahead and the mountains beyond and told herself, this is where you are now, learn it. The Billings station had smelled of coal smoke and cold iron and the particular desperation of people in transit. Nora had stood on the platform with her carpet bag at her feet and the wind off the Beartooth Range cutting through her traveling dress in a way that her traveling dress was not built to survive, and she had waited. She had almost expected no one to come. That was not bitterness. That was arithmetic. She had learned in the 7 months since her father died to calculate odds with some accuracy, and the odds on this particular arrangement had never been favorable. A mail-order bride contract drawn up by a woman named Harriet Drummond, who smelled of rosewater and conducted her business from a narrow office above a tailor shop in Chicago, a man she had never met, a territory she had only seen on maps. The whole thing had the texture of a transaction made under duress by people who did not trust each other and were too tired to pretend otherwise. And yet, she had not stayed in Springfield. That was the calculation she kept returning to in the long hours on the train, watching the planes flatten and then rise again into something more serious. She had not stayed because staying was not a choice that was genuinely available to her. Her father, Elias Whitfield, had been a minister with a good mind and a poor head for money, and when he died, he had left behind $400 in debt, a house that belonged to the bank within 60 days, and a sister who lived in Cincinnati with 6 children, and a husband who had made it clear through 3 letters in rapid succession that he could not take on another mouth. And there was Everett Crane. Everett was her mother's brother, which made him her uncle by blood and her enemy by disposition. He was a thin, careful man who wore good clothes and owed money to people who wore worse ones. And when her father died, he had appeared at the house within a week, which told her everything she needed to know about how long he had been waiting. He called it fulfilling his family obligation. He called it looking after the girl. He had her sign a document she had only partially read, and he had collected $200 from a woman named Harriet Drummond, and he had told Nora she was going west to keep house for a widower in Montana Territory. He had said widower, singular. He had not said 3 brothers. He had not said bride. Those were the 2 things Nora had discovered independently the night before she left Springfield. She had found the original contract in Everett's desk in the locked drawer she knew how to open because she had watched her father open it with a letter opener many times. The contract was written in Harriet Drummond's cramped, careful hand. It said bride. It said Colt Aldridge. It said 3 children. Nora had stood in that study for a long time with the contract in her hand. Then she had folded it and put it in her own coat pocket, and she had packed her carpet bag, and she had taken the revolver her father had kept in the same desk, and she had gone to bed. The revolver was still with her, under her skirt in a small holster her father had made for her the year she turned 16, when he had decided she was old enough to understand that the world was not as safe as a good man wanted it to be for his daughter. It was a small gun, a .32 caliber pocket revolver, and she could hit a tin can at 40 feet and had once, to her considerable surprise, scared it off a farmhand who had followed her home from the market by simply showing it to him. She did not expect to need it, but her father had taught her that the time to have a thing is before you need it, not after. She had been standing on the Billings platform thinking about the contract and the revolver and the dead weight of everything she had left behind when she saw them. 3 men walking toward her from the far end of the platform, and the first thing she thought was, they are all the same height, which was not true, but was the impression you got because they were all so large that the variations between them seemed minor. 6'3", 6'4", something in that range, broad through the shoulders in the way that comes from years of physical labor and not from any kind of vanity. They wore heavy coats and work-worn boots and the kind of hats that had been new a long time ago and had since been shaped by weather and use into something entirely personal. The one in front was Colt. She knew it before anyone said a word. He had the bearing of a man who had been first for so long that he no longer thought about it. He walked like a man whose mind was always slightly ahead of his body already, at the next task, the next fence post, the next problem to be solved. His eyes found her on the platform and assessed her with the frank practicality of someone making an inventory, and there was nothing cruel in it and nothing kind. It was simply accurate. He said her name, Nora Whitfield, a statement, not a greeting. She said yes. The man behind his right shoulder was Bram. Bram was the broadest of the 3, with hands that she would later learn belonged to a blacksmith and eyes that missed less than they let on. He gave her a single nod and asked if the journey had been all right, and his voice had the flatness of a man who asked practical questions because he had learned that the other kind tended to complicate things. The man on Colt's left was Whit, and Whit was different from his brothers in a way she could not immediately name. He was younger 27 to Bram's 31 and Colt's 35, and there was something about him that had not yet been entirely compressed by the weight of the life they all lived. He held his hat in front of his chest with both hands. He looked at her and then looked at the ground and then looked back up. He was the only one who asked if she was hungry. She was. She had not eaten since a small meal at the rail stop in Laurel some hours back. But she said she was fine because there are some needs you do not announce to strangers. Colt picked up her carpet bag and said the wagon was ready and walked away, and she followed, and that had been the beginning of this. The wagon turned through a gate as the last light was going out of the sky, and Nora looked up and saw the ranch. It was larger than she had imagined. That was the first thing. She had built a picture in her mind during the long hours on the train, a picture assembled from the practical details in Harriet Drummond's description: remote working ranch, no immediate neighbors, cold winters. In her mind, it had come out small and slightly defeated looking, the kind of place that announces through its appearance that the people inside it have been beaten down to the essential. But this was not that. Aldridge Ranch was built by men who expected to stay. The main house was 2 stories of heavy timber, solid and square, with a steeply pitched roof that understood Montana winters, and a covered porch that ran the length of the front. The barn was larger than the house because on a working ranch, the animals come first, and it had been built with the same deliberate permanence as everything else. There was a blacksmith shed to the east, its chimney dark at this hour. There was a smokehouse, a root cellar marked by its low door set into the hillside, a chicken coop. Fence posts marched away into the dimness in both directions. Everything was functional. Nothing was extra. Colt helped her down from the wagon with a single brief grip on her arm that lasted exactly as long as it needed to and no longer. And then he handed her carpet bag to Whit and said without particular inflection, "The house is open." He walked toward the barn. She stood for a moment in the cold carpet bag in Whit's hand, watching Colt's retreating back. Bram came up beside her and said, "He is not unfriendly, just busy." She said she understood. Bram said, "Come on then." Inside the house was clean in the way that a house is clean when men have been doing the cleaning themselves for 2 years and have made a discipline of it, because the alternative is a kind of disorder they cannot afford. There were no curtains on the windows, no rugs on the floors, except a braided oval in front of the fireplace worn thin, no pictures on the walls, no decorative objects, nothing that was present purely because it was pleasant to look at. The furniture was heavy and plain and had been made to last. A long table with 4 chairs and 1 smaller stool. A stone fireplace with a cast iron stove set into it. A sideboard against the wall. A steep staircase rising to the upper floor. On the table, 4 bowls. White china chipped at the rims. 4 spoons. 4 cups. Someone had counted her. She stood in the doorway and looked at those 4 settings and felt something move in her chest that she could not easily name. It was not gratitude exactly, and it was not relief. It was something smaller than that. The recognition that someone had performed the small arithmetic of her presence before she arrived. Then she heard a sound from the hallway and she looked up. They were standing in a row, 3 children at the edge of the lamplight, watching her from the shadows of the corridor with the wide, careful eyes of people who have learned to evaluate new things before committing to a response. The smallest was a girl of about 3 with dark brown hair that had been curled by nature into something her brothers had clearly given up trying to manage, and she had both arms wrapped around a cloth doll that had been repaired many times and one thumb anchored firmly in her mouth. She was watching Nora with the absolute unguarded attention of a very young child who does not yet know it is impolite to stare. This was Ivy. The middle child was a boy of 6, Cal, who was standing straight with his small shoulders pulled back and his sister's sleeve in one hand, and his face had the expression of someone who has appointed himself responsible for something and is taking the appointment seriously. He had Colt's jaw even at that age. He would have it more when he was older. The oldest was Levi. 8 years old, arms crossed, jaw set, and his eyes were his father's eyes, gray and measuring, but in them was something his father's eyes did not have at this particular moment: anger. Or not anger exactly, something underneath anger. The particular quality of expression that belongs to a person who has lost something they love very much and has not yet found anywhere safe to put that loss. Nora set down her bag. She walked toward them, not quickly, and she stopped a few feet away and crouched down so that she was level with Ivy, who watched her approach without retreating, which she took as a small encouragement. She said, "Hello, my name is Nora." Cal said nothing. Levi's jaw tightened. Ivy took her thumb out of her mouth. Her voice was very small and very serious. She said, "Are you the new mama?" The hallway went very quiet. Bram behind her made no sound. Whit near the stairs did not move. Nora looked at Ivy. She looked at Cal. She looked at Levi, who was watching her with those gray eyes that had seen something they should not have seen at his age, waiting for her to say the wrong thing. She could have said no, of course not. She could have said, "I am here to help your father." She could have said a dozen things that were safe and deflective and would have created a comfortable distance between herself and the truth of what she did not yet know. She said, "I am not sure yet, but I am here, and I would like to know your names." Levi turned and walked away. His footsteps were deliberate on the stairs, and he did not look back. Cal took his hand back from Ivy's sleeve and looked at the floor. But Ivy, who was 3 years old and had not yet learned to protect herself from hoping, took her thumb out of her mouth and said, "I am Ivy. And that is Cal. And the one who walked away is Levi. He does that a lot." Nora said, "That is all right." And she meant it. Her room was at the end of the upper hallway, a small square space with a narrow bed and a washstand, and a single window that looked out over the back field toward the tree line. The walls were bare pine planks. The floor was bare boards. The room was not uncomfortable, but it was the room of a place that had not expected a woman and had prepared accordingly. On the small table beside the bed, someone had left a candle and a folded piece of paper. Nora lit the candle and unfolded the paper. It was a list of daily tasks written in a hand she would come to recognize as Colt's because it wrote the way he spoke, short, precise, no unnecessary words. The stove required oak, not pine. The water pump in the yard froze when the temperature dropped below 15 degrees and needed warming before use. Breakfast was at 5. The chickens were fed before the horses, not after. She read down the list and noted the particulars and the order and the reasoning implied by the sequence of tasks, and she was nearly at the bottom when she saw it. A second hand, different from the first. Lighter, slightly uncertain, as though the writer had added it later and had not been entirely sure about doing so. The words said, "Ivy wakes at 3 in the morning. She is not calling for you. Do not open the door. She will settle on her own in a few minutes." Nora read those words twice. She thought about who had written them. Not Colt, the handwriting was wrong. Bram had hands that were better suited to iron than to fine letters. That left Whit, and when she thought about Whit standing on the Billings platform with his hat in his hands, asking if she was hungry, she thought yes. Probably Whit. And she thought about what it meant that someone in this house had thought carefully enough about her first night here to warn her, had imagined her lying awake in the dark, hearing a child cry, not knowing what to do, had taken the time to give her the information she would need so that she would not make a mistake out of ignorance. It was a small thing. It was not a small thing. She set the paper down on the table and looked at the candle flame for a while. Then she undressed and got into the narrow bed and pulled the blankets up and lay in the dark. Listening to the sounds of the house settling around her, she thought about the contract in her coat pocket, the one that said Bride and Colton, Aldridge and 3 children. She thought about Levi walking away up the stairs. She thought about Ivy's voice, very small and very serious. "Are you the new mama?" She did not decide anything that night. She was not the kind of person who made decisions in the dark when she was tired and far from home. But she lay there in the narrow bed in the room that had not expected her, and she listened to the wind come down off the Beartooth Range and push against the pine walls of the house, and she thought, "I am here now. Whatever else is true, I am here." She was still thinking this when the candle burned itself out. At 3 in the morning, she heard it. A sound from down the hall, small and thin at first, the kind of sound a child makes when they are still half asleep, and the thing they are afraid of exists in the space between sleep and waking. Then more continuous, a soft, rhythmic crying that had no demand in it, no expectation of answer, just the simple, terrible sound of someone who has called before and learned not to wait for anyone to come. Nora lay in the dark and counted. She got to 7 before she got up. She did not light the candle. She felt her way down the hall by the faint cold light that came through the window at the end of the corridor, and she stood outside the door that the crying was coming from, and she thought about the note, "Do not open the door, she will settle." The crying did not settle. She opened the door. The room was dark. Ivy was sitting in the corner of her bed with her cloth doll pressed against her chest and her face wet, and she was not looking at the door. She was looking at the wall. Or she was looking at something that was not in the room, the way very small children sometimes look at things that the people around them have already stopped being able to see. Nora did not say anything. She did not turn on a light or offer explanation or ask questions. She sat down on the floor beside the bed, with her back against the wooden frame, and after a moment she began to hum. Not a song exactly, a melody her own mother had hummed, whose name she had never known that existed for her, as pure sound as a texture of memory older than language. For a few minutes Ivy kept crying. Then the crying became quieter. Then Ivy climbed down from the bed and sat in Nora's lap. She was warm and she smelled of sleep, and she still had her cloth doll pressed against her chest, and she was very small, in the way that 3-year-olds are small, in the way that always surprises you a little when you actually hold them. And Nora put her arms around her and kept humming, and after a while Ivy stopped crying entirely and her breathing slowed and deepened and she slept. Nora sat on the floor with Ivy in her arms until the cold light at the end of the hall began to change, and the house around her began to make the particular sounds that houses make before dawn, the first movements of people preparing for a day of hard work. She was still sitting there when she heard the footstep in the hall. It stopped outside the door. For a long moment, nothing, no knock, no voice. Then she heard a sound that she would think about for a long time afterward, the sound of a large hand touching a wooden door frame very gently, the way a person touches something they have been avoiding touching for a very long time. Just one brief contact, like a fingertip pressed to the surface of water. Then the footstep moved away. She heard it go down the stairs. She sat in the dark with the sleeping child in her arms and did not move for a while after that. When she came downstairs at 5 o'clock, having returned Ivy to her bed and dressed in the cold and made her way to the kitchen, Colt was already at the stove. He looked at her once when she came in. Not a long look, the same quality of glance he had given her at the Billings platform, assessing, brief, unrevealing. She went to the stove and began making the oatmeal she had located in the pantry the night before, and he stepped aside to give her room without being asked. She ate with the family that morning and noted everything she could learn from watching how the household ran, and after Colt and his brothers went out and the children had been fed, and Ivy was settled with her doll near the hearth, Nora began to understand the shape of what her days here would look like. They would look like work. That was fine. She had never been afraid of work. In the late afternoon of her 4th day at Aldridge Ranch, Nora went to find a second candle in the storage room off the kitchen and discovered behind a crate of pickled vegetables a piece of paper folded twice. It had fallen there or been placed there, and she did not know which. She picked it up and unfolded it. It was a copy of the contract. She recognized Harriet Drummond's handwriting immediately, the careful, cramped letters of a woman who had spent her life reducing human arrangements to ink on paper. The contract covered 2 pages and addressed the particulars of her transportation, her housing, her duties in the household, and the arrangement between the parties. She read it fully this time in a way she had not been able to in Everett's study, where she had been cold and frightened and moving quickly. She read every clause. She read the part that said housekeeper and the part that said she would be provided with room and board and a small monthly wage. She read the standard language about duration and termination, and then she read the line that Harriet Drummond had written in a slightly different ink, as though it had been added after the rest. Bride for Colt, Aldridge widower, head of household. She stood in the storage room with the contract in her hands for a long moment. Then she thought about the note on the first night, the way Colt had stood aside without being asked at the stove. Then she thought about Levi on the stairs. She folded the contract carefully and put it in the deep pocket of her work dress next to where she kept her father's small revolver. She did not know yet what she was going to do with the information. Someone in this house, for reasons she did not yet understand, had sent the original letter to Chicago without telling Colt what was in it. She only knew that she needed to understand the ground she was standing on before she decided where to step. That evening after supper, she was washing the dishes when she heard a sound and went to the kitchen window and looked out, and in the last gray light, she saw the back field, and beyond it the tree line. And between them, perhaps 30 steps from the kitchen door, a single pine tree larger than any of the others. And at the base of that pine tree, a wooden marker. She could not read the words from this distance, but she knew what it was before she put on her coat and walked out into the cold to stand before it. Clara Aldridge, beloved wife and mother, 1842 to 1876. Below the name carved in a different hand, the letters slightly uneven, clearly cut by someone whose hands were better suited to other tools. Still here, always here. Nora stood before the grave in the failing light and looked at the name, and she thought about the folded contract in her pocket and the 3 children upstairs, and the man who stepped aside at the stove without being asked, and she thought about the question that was not yet a question, the thing that was forming slowly in the cold air around her, like ice forming on the surface of a river. She had arrived at this place as a transaction. She understood that. She held no illusions about it. Everett had sold her, and Harriet Drummond had brokered the sale, and someone at this ranch had set the thing in motion for reasons she had not yet uncovered. But a transaction is only what it starts as. What it becomes depends on the people inside it. She stayed at the grave until it was too cold to stay any longer. Then she went back inside. In the kitchen, the lamp was lit, and Whit was sitting at the table with a piece of wood in his hands and a small chisel, and he looked up when she came in and looked quickly back down at his work. She hung up her coat. She sat down across from him. After a while, she said, "Who carved the second line on her marker?" Whit did not look up. His chisel moved in small, careful increments. He said, "Colt. The winter after she died, middle of the night. Bram heard him out there and went to look, but didn't say anything. Just came back in." Nora looked at her hands on the table. She said she would have been glad he did that. Whit's chisel stopped moving. He looked up at her then, and in his eyes was something she had not expected, something undefended, something that belonged to a boy who had grown up without a mother in a house with no women in it and had not known until this moment that he had been waiting for someone to say that particular sentence out loud. He looked back down at his work. He said, "Yeah, I think she would have been." The night came down full and cold over the Gallatin Valley, and the ranch settled into its particular dark silence, and upstairs 3 children slept. And Nora Whitfield, who had arrived at this place as a line item in a contract, sat at the kitchen table in the lamplight and listened to the sound of a man carving wood, and thought that the ground she was standing on was harder than she had expected and more solid than she had feared. She did not know what was coming. She did not know about the fever that would take Ivy in 3 weeks' time, or the man named Silas Vance who would come to the ranch with money and intentions, or the night she would walk out into a blizzard with no plan except away, or the moment in a frozen field when a man who had not knelt for anything in 2 years would kneel in the snow in front of her and say the words he had been carrying for longer than he knew. She did not know any of that yet. She only knew that somewhere in this house were 3 children who had been sleeping through 3 o'clock in the morning alone for 2 years, and that last night one of them had not slept alone. She thought that was worth something. She thought she was worth something. She had been told in various ways and by various people that she was a transaction, a solution, a practical arrangement. She had let them say it because she had no power to stop them, and arguing would have cost her more than it gained. But she knew what she was. She was her father's daughter. She could read and cipher and shoot straight. She could sit on a cold floor at 3 in the morning and hum a melody she had no name for until a grieving child fell asleep. She could look at a contract that did not ask her permission and decide on her own terms what she was going to make of it. She was not a transaction. She was a person who had arrived somewhere new and was paying attention. And paying attention, her father had always said, is where everything begins. The lamp burned low on the table between them. Wit carved. The ranch breathed around them in the dark. And Nora stayed where she was in the kitchen of a house that had not expected her and let herself very quietly begin. The stove was the first lesson. Nora had grown up with a cast iron range in her father's kitchen in Springfield, and she understood the general principles of it, the dampers and the drafts, and the particular patience required when the fire was reluctant on a cold morning. What she had not understood until her first full day at Aldridge Ranch was that the stove here required oak and only oak, and that pine, which was plentiful and close at hand, and which she had used without thinking on that first morning, produced a smoke so thick and clingy that it coated the interior of the flue pipe within a single use and left the kitchen smelling like the inside of a tar barrel for the better part of a day. She discovered this because Bram told her. He came into the kitchen mid-morning, looked at the stove, looked at the ceiling where a thin haze was gathering near the rafters, and said oak only. Pine makes soot. There is a note on the side of the stove that says so. She looked. There was indeed a note written in small letters on a strip of paper and tacked to the side panel with a single nail. She had not seen it. She said, I apologize, I will remember. Bram said, no damage done, and went back out. That was the first lesson. There were many more. The water pump in the yard froze when the temperature dropped below 15 degrees, which in November in the Gallatin Valley was not an unusual event. The solution was to carry a pot of hot water from the stove to the pump and pour it slowly over the valve housing before applying pressure, a process that took about 3 minutes and became, once she learned it, as routine as breathing. Colt showed her this without explanation, performing the action once, while she watched, then stepping back and looking at her in a way that said, your turn. She did it. He nodded once and walked away. That was how Colt taught things. He did not explain. He demonstrated once, and then he waited to see if you had paid attention. If you had, he acknowledged it with a nod or a brief sound of confirmation. If you had not, he demonstrated again with the same unhurried patience, as though repetition were simply a natural feature of instruction and not a commentary on the student. There was no impatience in it and no condescension. He simply believed she came to understand that a person who was watching carefully enough would learn what they needed to learn, and that talking too much around a thing was often the slowest way to teach it. Bram taught differently. Bram taught in short declarative sentences with the economy of a man who had been communicating essential information in harsh conditions for most of his life. The knife is sharper than you think, use less pressure. Do not leave a cast iron pan empty on a hot stove for more than 2 minutes. The smokehouse key hangs on the left peg, not the right. His instructions had the quality of field reports, factual and complete, and containing nothing superfluous. And once she understood that they were not curt by intention, but simply direct by nature, she found them easy to follow and genuinely useful. Wit taught in stories. This was something she discovered on her 6th day when he found her in the pantry trying to work out the system by which the previous occupant had organized the preserved goods. He leaned against the door frame and watched her for a moment and then said, there is a system. Clara made it. Salt goods on the bottom shelf, sweet goods above dry goods on top. Bram reorganized it after she died and put everything wrong, and then put it back right after about a month when he got tired of not being able to find anything. She looked at him. He said she was particular about the pantry. She used to say that a woman who knows where everything is can find anything in the dark, and a woman who can find anything in the dark can get through anything. He paused. I think she meant it practically. About actual darkness. but it also sounds like something more when you say it. Nora looked at the shelves, salt on the bottom, sweet above, dried on top. She said that is a good system. Whit said she had good systems for most things. He said it the way people say things that are both true and painful at the same time, with the particular flatness that comes from having said the painful part quietly to yourself many times, until the volume of it has decreased, if not the weight. After that, whenever Nora needed to know something about how the ranch operated and why it operated that way, she asked Whit, because Whit would tell her the history of the thing along with the practical fact of it, and the history made the fact easier to remember and easier to care about. She learned that the blacksmith shed had been built the second winter because Bram had determined it was cheaper to make your own nails than to ride to town every time you needed them. She learned that the root cellar had been dug by all three brothers over the course of one summer, the summer their father was ill and could not work, and that the oldest stones in the cellar walls had their initials scratched into them by a 10-year-old colt who had been, according to Whit, extremely serious about the project. She learned that the big pine tree at the edge of the back field, the one under which Clara was buried, had been planted by their mother 30 years ago, and that it had been selected as Clara's resting place, not by accident, but by Colt, who had stood in the field for a long time before deciding and who had not explained his reasoning to anyone. Each of these things was a piece of the place she was learning to inhabit. Each piece fit with the others in ways that were not always immediately apparent, but became so over time. A house is not a collection of objects and routines. It is a history. It is a record of the decisions people have made about what matters and how to survive and what is worth preserving. To learn a house properly, you have to learn it as a story, and Whit, almost without meaning to, was teaching her the story. In the second week, she began to understand the children. Ivy was the simplest to understand, which is to say she was the most transparent, which is a quality that 3-year-olds possess not because they are uncomplicated, but because they have not yet learned that transparency is a vulnerability. She wanted proximity and warmth and the particular reassurance that comes from knowing someone is close by, and she communicated these wants with the directness of a person who has not yet been taught to be embarrassed by need. She began following Nora through the morning routines within 3 days, not helping exactly, but carrying things that were too light to need carrying, and handing Nora items that Nora had not asked for but accepted without comment. It became a kind of game between them, whose rules neither of them stated, but both understood. Cal was more careful than his sister, more watchful. He had appointed himself somewhere in the 2 years since his mother died as the person responsible for maintaining the order in the spaces between the adults, the small diplomatic work of a family that did not talk much about what it felt. He watched Nora for the first week with the attention of someone who was trying to determine if a new element is safe, and she let herself be watched without performing for it, because she understood that the watching was not hostile but protective, and that the best thing she could do was be consistent. By the end of the second week, he had begun to answer her questions. When she asked them directly, short answers at first, then longer ones, and once on a Thursday afternoon when she was mending a tear in his coat sleeve. He told her unprompted that his teacher at the school in Harlow Creek had a dog named Senator who slept under the schoolhouse steps, and that Senator was the best thing about going to school. She said, "What is the second best thing?" He thought about it seriously. He said, "Arithmetic." She said she had also been fond of arithmetic. He looked at her as though this were unexpected information about the nature of adults, which perhaps it was. Levi did not speak to her in the first week. He was present at meals and present at morning and evening chores and present in the general life of the household, but he maintained a distance that was not hostile in the way that Nora might have feared, not cold, just careful. He had built a perimeter around himself, and he was watching to see if she would respect it. She did. She did not pursue him or attempt to charm him or offer him things as inducements. She simply went about her work and let him be where he was, and she trusted without being certain that patience was the right tool for this particular problem. On the 9th evening, she baked honey bread. It was her mother's recipe, simple and sweet, and the smell of it filled the downstairs of the house, in a way that reached into the upper floor and brought Cal and Ivy down the stairs to sit at the kitchen table and watch the pan with an attention that she found touching. When it was done, she cut it into portions and put one on a small plate and climbed the stairs and set the plate outside Levi's door without knocking. She went back down and said nothing about it. In the morning, the plate was gone. In its place on the floor outside his door was a pine cone. Someone had painted it with ink, careful black lines over its natural scales, making a pattern that was clearly deliberate, but whose meaning she could not read. She picked it up and looked at it, and for a long time. She did not ask about it. He did not explain it. But that afternoon, for the first time, Levi came into the kitchen while she was starting supper and stood near the window without being asked, in the way that children stand, near something they are not ready to name yet. He did not speak. She did not make him. She handed him a carrot to peel, and he peeled it with the focus of someone performing an important task, and when it was done, she said thank you, and he set it on the board and left. It was not much. It was exactly enough. The morning of her 11th day, a sound came through the kitchen window that was different from the usual sounds of the ranch at work, and she looked out to see a man she did not recognize riding up the lane from the road. He was not a delivery rider. She knew that from the horse, which was too well kept and too carefully bred for a working messenger, and from the coat, which was the coat of a man with money who wanted you to know he had it. He rode with the ease of someone accustomed to arriving places and being noticed. And when Colt came out of the barn to meet him, the way the two men stood told her something before she could hear a word. Colt's posture did not change. That was the thing. He stood the way he always stood, with his weight settled and his shoulders level and his hands loose at his sides, and in another man that stillness might have read his ease. In Colt it read as the specific kind of stillness that precedes action. She dried her hands and went to the door. The man's name was Silas Vance. She learned this because he said it as he swung down from his horse with the confidence of a man who expects his name to mean something to the person hearing it. He was perhaps 44, broad and well-fed, with the particular assurance of someone who had been the largest figure in his immediate landscape for long enough that he had stopped imagining other landscapes. He looked past Colt at Nora in the doorway, and he smiled, and the smile did not change the calculation in his eyes at all. He said he had come to welcome the new arrival to the valley. He said he understood there was a woman at Aldridge Ranch now. He said it the way people say things when the actual meaning of what they are saying is something else entirely. Bram had come out of the blacksmith shed. Whit had appeared from somewhere near the barn. They did not gather with the deliberateness of men who had planned it. They simply moved to where they were needed the way they always had. Vance looked at the three of them and at Nora and said what he had come to say. He said a young woman like that deserved better than this particular hardship. He said he had a larger house and more comfort to offer, and considerably more in the way of practical security. He said he was prepared to compensate the Aldridge brothers generously for the inconvenience of revised arrangements. He said, "I will pay 3 times what you paid for her." The yard went very quiet. Nora heard the number and heard the word her, and felt both of them settle into her chest like 2 stones dropped into cold water, and she thought, there it is. The assumption that has been underneath everything from the beginning, that she was an object that had changed hands once and could change hands again. Colt said no. Just that. A single syllable, flat and absolute, with no qualification and no explanation attached to it, in the voice of a man who does not repeat himself because he has no intention of being misunderstood the first time. Vance said, "I am making a reasonable offer." Colt took 1 step forward. He did not say anything more. He did not need to. The step itself was the rest of the sentence, and Vance read it with the accuracy of a man who had spent his life making calculations about risk, and he decided correctly that the calculation here did not favor him. He gathered his reins. He looked at Nora one more time, and in his eyes was the particular expression of a man who has not gotten what he wanted, but intends to pursue the matter through other means. And he said just to her, quietly enough that only she could hear, "Your arrangement here is not as permanent as you may think. I have had a conversation with Everett Crane. He is willing to discuss the matter, Then he rode away. Nora stood in the doorway and watched him go, and felt the ground she had been learning to stand on shift slightly under her feet, the way ground shifts when you discover there is something underneath it that you did not know was there. Everett, still, even here. She said nothing about it to anyone that day. She turned back into the kitchen and finished the supper she had started, and she ate with the family that evening and listened to Cal tell a story about Senator the dog and helped Ivy with her spoon. And when the meal was done, she helped with the clearing and the washing, and she performed the evening routines with the same steadiness. She performed all the routines, and she did not let any of it show on her face. But that night alone in her room, she took the contract out of her pocket. She unfolded it and read it again in the lamplight. All of it this time, including the lines she had been turning over in her mind since she found it, bride for Colt Aldridge, widower, head of household. She thought about Bram. She had been thinking about Bram and the contract since she found it, and the more she thought about it, the more certain she became. Colt had not sent the letter to Harriet Drummond. Colt did not know. The way he had spoken to her in those first days, the absence of any reference to the word bride, the manner in which he had laid out their arrangement in the kitchen on the second morning as a practical agreement between parties who understood its limits, none of that was the manner of a man who thought he had sent for a wife. It was the manner of a man who thought he had made a temporary household arrangement and was managing it accordingly. Bram had done this. She was almost certain of it. And Bram had done it for reasons she did not yet fully understand but was beginning to. She folded the contract and put it away and lay in the dark for a long time. The next morning, she asked Bram to stay after breakfast. Colt had gone out early. Whit had taken the children to the barn to see a new foal that one of the mares had dropped in the night. The kitchen was quiet and the lamp was still lit against the pale gray of the early morning, and Nora put the contract on the table and set it between herself and Bram and said nothing. Just let him look at it. He looked at it for a moment. Then he picked up his coffee cup and held it in both hands and looked at the table. She said, "The contract says bride, not housekeeper. Bride. And it says Colt's name specifically." He did not deny it. She said he does not know. Bram was quiet for a moment. Then he said no. She said why. He set down the cup. He looked at her with the direct assessing eyes that she had learned were his version of respect, the same eyes he turned on a piece of iron he was deciding how to work. He said because he would not have agreed, he would not agree to anything that smelled like replacing Clara, because in his mind, replacing her is not something that can be done. And anyone who tries is either a fool or someone who didn't love her enough to understand what was lost. He has been this way since she died, and he will be this way until something changes the way he thinks about it. And I did not know how to change it from the inside, so I tried from the outside. She said, "You used me to do that." He was quiet. She said, "You made a decision about my life and my future and my person without asking if I had anything to say about it." He said, "Yes." The word came out plainly without deflection or excuse, and she understood that this was his version of an apology, not the articulation of regret, but the acknowledgement of fact, which was what he had available. She looked at him for a long moment. She said, "You were wrong about the way you did it, but I do not think you were wrong about what you saw. I think you saw something real." He met her eyes. She said, "But if you ever make a decision about me without asking me again, I will make sure you understand why that is not acceptable. Is that clear?" He said yes. She picked up the contract and folded it and put it back in her pocket. She said, "Now tell me about the water situation with the North Pasture fence, because Colt mentioned it was giving trouble and I want to understand the place I am living in." Bram looked at her for one more moment with an expression she could not entirely read, somewhere between assessment and something closer to relief. Then he pulled his chair closer to the table and told her about the fence. 3 days after her conversation with Bram, she found the grave marker. She had walked out to the back field in the late afternoon, as she had begun to do most days when the children were settled and the kitchen work was finished, because the open air and the mountains in the distance were the closest things she had found to the feeling of standing in her father's study, which had been in her life until now. The place where she went when she needed to think clearly. She had walked past the big pine tree several times, but always at a distance. This time she walked to it. The marker was a flat piece of pine board weathered to silver gray, with the name and dates cut into it in the careful, deep lines of a man who wanted the letters to outlast the wood. Clara Aldridge, beloved wife and mother, 1842 to 1876. And below, in a different hand, the letter slightly uneven, as though cut by a larger tool than was right for the work, or by hands that were not entirely steady. Still here, always here. She stood before it for a long time. She thought about what Whit had told her about Colt coming out to the grave in the winter dark, with a knife and no explanation, and Bram watching from a distance and saying nothing. She thought about what that act meant for a man who communicated primarily through action and almost never through words. The choosing of this particular form of expression, the private physical marking of a loss that he could not speak about and could not put down. She looked at the name on the marker and she thought Clara Elaine Aldridge. She liked violet flowers. She did not like venison. She had a system for the pantry and an instinct for what a child needed in the dark. And she had built something here that was still 2 years after her death, holding its shape, if only barely. Nora took off her right glove. She crouched down and pressed her bare hand to the cold ground at the base of the marker. She said quietly and entirely to herself, I am not here to take your place. I know that is not possible, and I would not try. But I want to take care of what you left, if you will permit it. She was not a superstitious person. She did not know if the dead could hear. But she thought that some things needed saying regardless of whether anyone heard them, because the saying of them was an act of honesty toward yourself, and honesty toward yourself was the foundation of everything her father had ever tried to teach her. She stood up and put her glove back on. She looked at the marker one more time, then she went back inside. She did not know that Levi had been standing at the corner of the barn 40 feet away and had watched her the whole time. She did not know that he had stood there in the cold without moving for the full length of her visit to the grave, and that when she turned and walked back toward the house, he had stayed where he was for another minute, looking at the marker and then at her retreating figure with an expression on his 8-year-old face that was trying to work out whether what he had just seen was something he should be suspicious of or something else entirely. She found out about it that evening. She was washing the supper dishes when she heard him come into the kitchen. She had learned to know his footstep, the particular quality of a child who puts his feet down deliberately. She kept washing. He stood near the door for a moment. Then he said to the general area of the kitchen, and not specifically to her, you spelled her name right. She turned slightly. He said on the marker, you looked at it carefully. Some people don't. She said, I made sure. He looked at her, then directly the gray Aldridge eyes with all their particular weight. He was 8 years old, and he looked in that moment much older, the way children look older when they have been responsible for their grief instead of simply inside it. He said she would have wanted her name right. Nora said, I know. He stood there for another moment. Then he walked out of the kitchen. She turned back to the dishes. Her hands were not quite steady. That night, Agnes Corbett came by with fabric she had promised to bring for a mending project, and she stayed for coffee the way she always did. And while she was pulling on her coat to leave, she stopped and looked at Nora with the direct appraising expression of a woman who has lived 65 years in a place that does not tolerate indirection. She said, you know that room you have been sitting in with Ivy these evenings? Nora said she did. Agnes said Clara's room. Colt locked the door the evening after the funeral and did not open it again for 8 months. When he finally opened it for Ivy to sleep in, he took all of Clara's things out and put them in the cider chest in the storage room. He has not touched the doorknob since. Until this week. Nora looked at her. Agnes said, Bram told me he heard Colt stop outside that door 2 nights running. Just stop and stand there. He has not done that in 2 years. She pulled her coat closed. She said, I am not telling you this to make you feel any particular way about it. I am telling you because you are in a situation where knowing things matters, and this is something worth knowing. She went out into the cold. Nora stood in the kitchen after she left and looked at the lamp on the table and thought about a man standing outside a door he had not been able to approach for 2 years, and what it might mean that something had changed the distance between him and that door, and what she wanted to do with that information and what she did not. She had not come here for sentiment. She had not come here hoping to be saved by anything, including her own feelings. But she was honest enough and had always been honest enough to know when something was happening that was larger than the practical arrangement she had agreed to, and to understand that the question of what she was going to do about it was not going to wait indefinitely for her to decide she was ready to answer it. The blizzard came without warning on the third week of November. Nora was in the kitchen when the temperature dropped 10 degrees in 20 minutes, which was the way serious weather announced itself in the Gallatin Valley, not with rain or darkening clouds, but with a sudden and absolute withdrawal of warmth, as though the mountain had simply decided to stop tolerating the presence of anything warm. Whit had gone out to check the young mare who had been restless all morning. He did not come back. Colt and Bram went out after him. Nora stood at the kitchen window and watched them disappear into the white, and then could not see the barn from where she stood, which meant visibility had dropped to less than 30 feet, which meant they were riding essentially blind. She did not stand at the window for long. The fire in the main room had gone out when the wind came down the chimney. She rebuilt it with the oak from the box beside the hearth methodically the way Colt had shown her. And then she found the small oil lamp in the storage room and lit that too. And she brought all three children to the main room and told them to stay there. And she went back to the kitchen. She found the medical kit. She boiled water and kept it hot. She pulled every extra blanket from the cedar chest in the upstairs hall and brought them down. She set the bottle of whiskey that Bram kept on the top shelf of the pantry for emergencies on the counter where it would be easy to reach. Cal helped without being asked. He carried the blankets. He kept Ivy from going to the window. He was 6 years old, and he understood in the wordless way of children who have learned to read a household's tension that what was required now was steadiness. Levi sat near the fire and did not speak, but he fed it. Each time the flames dropped, he added wood with the focused attention of someone who has decided that this one thing is within his control, and he will not let it fail. They came back 2 hours later. Whit had gone down in a drift near the north fence line, a fall that had wrenched his knee badly, but broken nothing. Bram's right hand was white with cold and needed warming slowly. Colt came in last, and when he stepped through the door and saw the fire high and the water hot and the blankets stacked and Nora already moving toward Whit with the medical kit in her hands, he stopped in the doorway for a long moment. She did not look up. She was examining Whit's knee with the careful, systematic attention of someone who was concentrating on the work and not on being watched doing it. She said, "Sit down, Bram. Put your hand here near the lamp. Not close, just near." Bram sat. She did not ask Colt to do anything because Colt was already doing it, banking the fire in the kitchen stove and checking the water she had set to boil and moving through the room with the efficiency of a man who has returned from something difficult and is grateful to find that the things he came back to are still intact. It was late when the house finally quieted. Whit was settled on the downstairs cot with his knee wrapped. Bram's hand had color back in it. The children were asleep. Nora was still in the kitchen when Colt came down for the last time. She was washing the instruments she had used her back to the room, and she heard him stop at the table. She heard the particular sound of a ceramic cup being set down. She turned. He had poured her coffee first. He was already looking toward the window. She picked up the cup. She did not say anything. Neither did he. Outside, the blizzard had settled into the long, patient snowfall that follows the violence of the first storm, and the ranch was buried in quiet and entirely itself. She drank the coffee and thought that some things do not need to be named to be understood. The incident with the bull happened on her 17th day. She was alone in the yard near the chicken coop early afternoon when she heard the fence on the eastern side of the property give way the particular sound of wooden rails under pressure. They were not designed to hold, and then the heavier sound of something large moving through the gap. She turned and saw the bull. It was not their bull. It was the bull from the Pemberton place to the east, A large roan animal that she had been told by Bram was poorly tempered in the best of circumstances. And this was not the best of circumstances because the animal had come through the fence at speed and was now in the yard, and its ears were back, and its attention was fixed on her with the flat, total focus of something that has decided on a direction and has not yet found a reason to revise it. Nora did not run. Her father had told her once running from a large animal that can outrun you is an instruction to that animal about what to do next. Instead, she stood still and she moved her right hand slowly under her apron to the holster beneath her skirt, and she wrapped her fingers around the grip of the revolver, and she waited. She did not draw it. Not yet. She watched the bull's shoulders because the shoulders tell you before the legs do. The bull took 2 steps toward her. Then something changed in the air of the yard. Colt was there. She had not heard him come. He was simply there between her and the bull, with a 6-foot fence rail in his hands, and his presence in that space was so immediate and so total that the bull stopped and redirected its attention. And within 30 seconds, Bram had come around the other side of the yard, and they worked the animal back toward the gap in the fence while Whit appeared from somewhere to hold it closed until a temporary repair could be made. It was over quickly, efficiently, as though it had been rehearsed. When it was done and the bull was on the other side of the fence and Bram was driving posts, Colt turned back toward the yard. He saw the revolver. She still had her hand on it under her apron, and when she drew her hand out, the gun came with it, and she held it for a moment before she thought to put it away, and in that moment his eyes went to it and then to her face. She expected something, a question or a comment or a change in his expression. He looked at the gun and then he looked at her, and what she saw in his face was not surprise. It was not concern or disapproval or any of the things she might have prepared a response to. It was something closer to recognition. The specific look of a man who has just revised an assumption and found the revision accurate. He nodded once. He walked back to the barn. That evening she was sitting near the kitchen window after supper, writing a letter she did not intend to send to her father, the kind of letter you write, not because there is anyone to receive it, but because the act of writing it is the closest you can get to a conversation you cannot have any other way. She wrote about the ranch and the children and the 3 brothers and the way the mountains looked in the morning when the light first came over them, blue and enormous and entirely indifferent to the smallness of everything at their feet. She heard Colt's step in the hall. He stopped in the doorway of the kitchen and she looked up. He said, "The gun. Did your father teach you?" She said, "Yes." He said, "Is it reliable?" She said, "I have never had reason to doubt it." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Good." He went back down the hall. She looked at the letter on the table for a moment. Then she wrote at the bottom, "I am beginning to understand this place. And I think when I understand it fully, I will find that it is somewhere I can live." She did not know yet if she was right about that, but she thought it was worth writing down. Because her father had also told her the things you commit to paper have a way of becoming true if you mean them when you write them. She meant it. She folded the letter and set it with the other she had written in the small leather case at the bottom of her carpet bag, and she blew out the lamp, and she went upstairs. Outside, the Gallatin Valley lay under a sky thick with stars, and the mountains stood in their enormous dark patience. And the ranch was quiet in the particular way it was quiet when everything in it was for the moment where it was supposed to be. The fever came on a Tuesday. Nora noticed it first in the way Ivy held her spoon at breakfast, not eating, just turning it over in her small fingers, the way a child does when the world has gone slightly wrong, and she does not yet have words for why. Her cheeks had a color that was not the color of cold air and exertion. Her eyes were too bright and too still at the same time. Nora set down her own spoon and reached across the table and pressed the back of her hand to Ivy's forehead. The heat was immediate and unmistakable. She looked up. Colt was watching her from across the table. She did not need to say anything. He saw it in her face. He said, "How bad?" She said, "Bad enough." He pushed back his head. He would ride to Harlow Creek for Dr. Prentice. Bram said he would go instead. Colt should stay close. They looked at each other the way brothers look at each other when the decision has already been made before either of them spoke, and Bram stood up and got his coat and was gone within 10 minutes. By noon, Ivy had stopped eating entirely. By mid-afternoon, her small body was shaking under the blankets in a way that had nothing to do with cold, and she had begun to call out in her sleep for someone who was not in the room. She was calling for Clara. Nora did not hesitate. She built up the fire in the small bedroom, the room that had been Clara's and was now Ivy's, and she boiled water and found the dried peppermint leaves in the pantry that she had noticed weeks ago without knowing when she would need them. And she made a compress and folded it and laid it across Ivy's forehead with the same deliberate care she put into everything that mattered. She stripped the damp nightgown and replaced it with a dry one. She pulled the blankets tight and then sat on the edge of the bed with her hand resting lightly on Ivy's small back, feeling the rise and fall of her breathing, counting the rhythm of it, the way her father had taught her to count the rhythm of a sick person's breath. Because the rhythm tells you things that the face does not always show. Cal stood in the doorway. He said nothing. He was 6 years old and he was watching his sister with the expression of a child who is trying very hard to be old enough for the situation and is not quite there yet. Nora said she is going to be all right, but I need you to do something for me. He straightened. She said, I need you to make sure Levi eats something at supper, and I need you to keep Ivy's door closed so she can rest. Can you do that? He said yes. His voice was steady. She said, good. You are being very helpful. He stood there a moment longer as though the receiving of those words required a moment to settle. Then he went back down the hall. Dr. Prentice came at dusk, a small, dry man with careful hands who examined Ivy with the thoroughness of someone who understood that in this part of the territory, a doctor's visit might be the only one available, and he needed to get it right the first time. He confirmed what Nora had already concluded, a lung fever not uncommon in children this age, in the cold months serious but manageable if the fever was kept from climbing too high and the child was kept warm and hydrated. He said, you have been doing the right things. Keep doing them. Someone should be with her through the night. He looked at Nora when he said this. Not at Colt, not at Bram. At Nora. She said, I will be here. He nodded and packed his bag, and Bram rode with him back toward the road. That night, Nora did not sleep. She sat beside Ivy's bed through the long, cold hours, changing the compress, when it warmed coaxing sips of honey water, between the child's cracked lips with the patient persistence of someone who understands that small efforts repeated many times are how the difficult things get done. When Ivy cried, she held her. When Ivy coughed, she supported her small shoulders and spoke quietly into her hair. Not words exactly, just sound, the particular low murmur of a human voice close by, which is one of the oldest forms of reassurance that exists. Cal slept on a blanket outside the door. She discovered this at 2 in the morning when she stepped out for a moment and nearly tripped over him. She looked at him for a while, this 6-year-old boy curled on the cold hallway floor with his coat pulled over him for a blanket, and she thought about what it meant that he had chosen that rather than his own warm bed, this proximity to his sister, even separated by a closed door. And she thought this family knows how to love people. They have just forgotten how to say so. She got an extra blanket from the cedar chest and covered him more thoroughly and went back into Ivy. On the second night toward midnight, she looked up from the bedside and saw Colt. He was at the window, outside the window, standing in the yard in the dark with his coat on and the snow collecting on his shoulders. He was looking in through the glass. She could not read his expression in the shadows, but neither of them moved for a long moment, just the glass and the lamplight and the cold distance between them. She turned back to Ivy and adjusted the compress and kept her voice low and steady, and when she looked back at the window a few minutes later, he was gone. Only the marks of his boots remained in the snow. 2 dark impressions in the white close together facing the house. She thought about those boot prints for a long time after. On the third morning, Ivy's fever broke. It happened gradually, degree by degree, the way a fever surrenders rather than all at once, the heat receding until sometime before dawn, the child's skin cooled under Nora's hand, and her breathing deepened and evened out, and she slept the real sleep of recovery rather than the restless chasing sleep of fever. Nora sat in the chair beside the bed and watched her breathe and felt something release in her own chest that she had not fully acknowledged was held tight. When Ivy woke mid-morning, her eyes were clear. She looked at Nora with the slightly bewildered attention of a child returning from a long distance, taking in the familiar room and the unfamiliar presence in the chair beside her. And for a moment, her face worked through several expressions without settling on one. Then she reached out and took hold of Nora's hand with both of her small ones. She said in the careful, quiet voice of someone who has been ill and knows it and is glad to be returning, Mama Nora, you stayed. The words were very simple. They were the simplest words, and they struck Nora somewhere below the level of reason, in the place where the things that are true before you have words for them live, and she felt them land there and stay. She said, of course I stayed. She smoothed the hair back from Ivy's forehead. She said, now I am going to bring you some broth, and you are going to drink all of it. Those are the terms. Ivy said, what if I do not want broth? Nora said those are still the terms. Ivy considered this seriously and then said, all right. Nora stood and turned toward the door and stopped. Colt was in the doorway. She did not know how long he had been there. Long enough to have heard Ivy's words, certainly. Long enough to have heard hers. He was standing with one hand on the door frame, and his face held an expression she had not seen on him before. Not the controlled, assessed blankness he generally offered the world, but something that had gotten past that. Something that the two words Mama Nora had apparently been strong enough to breach. He looked at Ivy. He said with the particular roughness that enters a voice when it has been doing something other than speaking, how do you feel, little one? Ivy said tired and hungry. Nora says broth. He said broth is right. He looked at Nora. His voice had come back to its usual register, but something underneath it had changed. He said, I will get the fire built up in the kitchen. He went. Nora stood in the doorway of Clara's room and looked at the empty space where he had been and thought there is something happening here that is larger than a practical arrangement. She had known this for some time. She had been choosing carefully how quickly to acknowledge it. She thought that the pace of acknowledgement was no longer entirely her choice to make. 3 weeks after Ivy's fever broke, Levi went into the North Pasture Corral alone. Nora was in the kitchen when it happened. She heard the sound first, the metallic crash of a dropped bucket, sharp and sudden in the cold air, and then in the silence that followed it, nothing, which was the wrong kind of nothing, the kind that means something has happened and the world is holding its breath around it. She was out the door before she had finished thinking. Cal was standing at the corral fence, white-faced, both hands gripping the top rail. Inside the corral, the roan gelding that had been brought in for shoeing was moving in tight, agitated circles, and Levi was on the ground near the fence, not moving. She cleared the fence without stopping and crossed the corral and got between Levi and the horse, and she was aware of the horse behind her and aware that this was not ideal, but Levi was 8 years old and he was on the ground, and the geometry of the situation did not offer better options. She crouched over him with her arms wide and her weight forward, and she spoke to the horse in the same low, continuous tone she had used with Ivy in the fever nights. And the horse slowed and backed, and then Colt was over the fence and taking the animal by the halter, and Bram was there, and Whit was there, and Nora was already on her knees beside Levi with her hands on his face. His eyes were open. That was the first thing. His eyes were open and looking at her unfocused but present, which meant something essential was still connected. There was blood at his temple, not a great deal, but enough, and she pressed her hand flat against it and said his name once clearly, not loudly. He blinked. She said, I have you. Do not try to move yet. He did not move. Colt lifted him, not hastily, not with the desperate force of panic, but with the careful, controlled strength of a man who understands that how you carry something matters as much as the fact of carrying it. He brought Levi inside and up the stairs, and Nora followed, and the next hours passed in the focused urgency of people doing what needs to be done without wasting time on anything else. Dr. Prentice came again. He examined Levi thoroughly and said what could be said. The boy was strong and young, and the impact had been significant, but did not appear to have caused the worst of what it might have caused. There was no way to know yet everything that needed to be known. The brain, he said, sometimes needed time. They would watch. They would wait. He looked at Colt when he said this. Colt's face was the face of a man receiving information he has been afraid of receiving for a long time. Not this specific information, but the category of it. The kind that says something you love may be taken from you. Again. Nora put her hand briefly on Colt's arm just for a moment, just enough to indicate that she was there, and then she went in to sit with Levi. She sat with him through 4 days. She read from her father's Bible sometimes aloud, and sometimes only in the movement of her lips, because the words were less important than the sound, the continuous human presence of a voice in the room. She told him stories, the ones her father had told her when she was small, frontier stories and river stories, and the particular kind of story that involves a problem being solved through stubbornness and cleverness, which had always been her favorite kind. She described the ranch to him as she saw it from the window beside his bed, the way the snow lay on the north pasture, the way the horses moved in the cold, the particular way the smoke from the kitchen chimney rose straight up in still air and sideways in wind. Colt came to the door each evening. He stood in the doorway and looked at his son and looked at Nora and did not come in. She understood, she thought, what the doorway was for him, the border between what he could face and what he could not. She did not push him across it. On the second night, she spoke to the doorway without turning to look at it. She said, "It is not your fault. He went in there to protect his brother. That is what you have taught him to do." Silence. She said, "A boy who runs toward his brother when there is danger is a boy who was raised right. You need to know that." She heard him breathe. She heard him put his hand on the doorframe, the same gesture she had learned to recognize the touching of something solid when the inside of a thing is too unsteady to trust. He did not answer, but he did not leave immediately either, and she thought that was something. On the fourth night late, she was sitting beside Levi's bed in the low lamplight, and the house had gone quiet around her, and she was very tired, in the particular way you are tired when you have been holding something together by will for a long time, and the will is beginning to require more maintenance than usual. She leaned close to Levi and she said quietly, just to him and to the room and to whatever it is you speak to when you speak to someone who may or may not be able to hear you. You are not allowed to leave us, not now, not when we have only just started to find each other. Cal has been sleeping outside your door every night since you were hurt. Ivy drew a picture of the two of you every day and put them in a pile beside her bed because she said she was saving them for when you woke up. Your father stands at your door every evening and he cannot come in because he loves you too much to see you this way and survive it, and that is not weakness. That is what it costs to love someone that much. She paused. She said, "And I am not finished learning who you are. You have only just started to let me. I will not accept that as an ending." The room was very still. Then Levi's hand moved. It was small, the movement, a slow opening of the fingers on his right hand, and then a closing, and she watched it with the absolute attention of someone who has been waiting for precisely this and cannot trust it yet. She put her hand under his and felt his fingers close around hers with a grip that was weak but deliberate. She did not move. His eyes opened slowly with the particular heaviness of someone returning from a great distance, blinking at the lamplight in the ceiling and the room around him, with the confused, searching expression of a person reassembling themselves from component parts. He looked at the ceiling. He looked at the lamp. He looked at her. His voice was barely a voice at all. It was a scrape of sound that was shaped like words. He said, "Mama Nora, did you cry for me?" She pressed her free hand over her mouth. She felt the tears come before she had decided to let them, which was how it was sometimes with the things you had been holding back longest. She nodded. She could not speak for a moment. He looked at her for a while. Then his eyes drifted closed again, but his hand did not release hers, and his breathing was different now, slower and more even, the breathing of someone who has come back to a place they intended to return to. Behind her in the doorway, she heard a sound. A low, rough sound quickly controlled the sound a man makes when something inside him gives way and he catches it before it falls completely. She did not turn around. She gave Colt Aldridge his privacy because she understood that some things need to be felt in a space that belongs only to the person feeling them. After a long moment, she heard him step back from the doorway. She sat with Levi until morning, and he slept, and his hand stayed in hers. Everett Crane arrived on a Thursday. He came on the afternoon coach from Billings, which meant he had been traveling for the better part of 3 days, which meant he had decided to come before he fully knew the outcome of Levi's injury, which told her something about the urgency he was operating under. He was thinner than she remembered, and his good coat had taken the beating of a long journey, but his eyes were the same, careful and calculating and moving quickly over the yard and the house and the three brothers, and finally settling on her with the particular expression of a man who has come to retrieve something he believes he owns. He said, "Nora, you look well." She said, "What do you want, Everett?" He pulled a folded document from his inside coat pocket. He did not unfold it immediately. He held it the way a man holds a card he is not ready to play, yet letting the fact of its existence do preliminary work. He said the arrangement was legally questionable. He said she had been a minor in his legal care when the contract was signed, and there were grounds to contest it, and he had taken the trouble to have a lawyer in Springfield look at the matter. He said he had also been in contact with Silas Vance, who was willing to make a generous and permanent arrangement, a proper one with full legal standing and considerably more comfort than she currently had access to. He said all of this in the reasonable, measured tone of a man who believes he is doing someone a favor. Colt stood beside her and said nothing. Bram stood to her left. Whit stood near the porch steps. None of them had moved since Everett began speaking, and the quality of their stillness was the particular quality of men who are waiting to see if the situation resolves itself or requires them. Nora looked at the document in Everett's hand. She said, "How much is Vance paying you?" Everett's measured expression shifted slightly. "Just slightly." She said, "The first time you sold me, it was $200. I have found the original contract. I know the number. So whatever Vance is offering you can consider whether it is enough to cover what you are about to lose when you go back to Springfield without me." He said, "I am your legal guardian. The document I have here is from a circuit court judge who agrees that the original contract was signed under questionable circumstances." She said, "Then we will go see another judge." She said it simply and without hesitation because she had been thinking about this possibility since the afternoon Vance rode away from the ranch and said Everett's name, and she had decided somewhere during those long nights with Ivy and with Levi that the ground she was standing on was the ground she was going to defend, and that defending it was not something she was going to do through anyone else. They rode to Harlow Creek the next morning, all of them except Whit, who stayed with the children. Bram had arranged the meeting with Thane Orville Tate 2 days prior through a letter sent by the Harlow Creek postmaster, and Thane Tate was waiting for them in his office above the land records building, a man of 60, with the economy of someone who had presided over enough human disputes to know that most of them could be settled faster if people would stop performing and start speaking plainly. He read Everett's document. He read the original contract. He set both of them on the desk in front of him and looked at Nora. He said, "Young woman, are you here of your own will?" She said, "I came here by a route that was not of my choosing, but I have stayed by my own choice, and I intend to continue staying by my own choice, and that choice is not subject to revision by anyone in this room or any other." He said, "That is direct." He looked at Everett. He said, "Do you have anything to add that you have not already put in writing?" Everett said several things. He said them carefully and with the practiced fluency of a man accustomed to constructing arguments in his favor. Thane Tate listened with the patience of a man who has heard all the variations of these arguments before. Then Tate picked up the document Everett had brought and set it to one side. He picked up the original contract. He said, "The question before me is not whether this contract was drafted under ideal circumstances, because it clearly was not. The question before me is whether this young woman is here against her will. She has stated clearly that she is not. I find no grounds to compel a revision of an arrangement that the principal party to it has chosen freely." He set down the contract. He said, "Case is settled." Everett looked at Nora for a long moment. She met his eyes without looking away. He said quietly, not for the room but for her, You do not know what you are giving up. She said, yes, I do. He picked up his document and put it back in his coat pocket and walked out. She stood in the office for a moment after he left, in the particular silence that follows the resolution of something that has been pressing against you for a long time. Bram was to her left. Colt was behind her. Colt put his hand on her shoulder. Just briefly, the same quality of touch he had used on the day of the bull, exactly as long as it needed to be no longer. But this time it was not the grip of steadying. It was something else. She felt it move through her like the sound of a bell, clean and resonant and unmistakable. She did not turn around. She said to the window in the street outside and the mountains beyond, all right, let us go home. The night she walked out into the snow came 3 weeks later, which was enough time for things to have settled and not enough time for her to have stopped listening for the sounds that had gathered beneath the settling. She had not meant to overhear. She had gone to the storage room for a jar of preserved plums she had promised Ivy for supper, and the storage room shared a wall with the back entry where Colt was talking to a man who had come to collect a debt on a piece of equipment. She did not know the man. She knew only his voice, which had the particular quality of a man testing the edges of his welcome while trying to appear friendly. The man said something about the woman at the ranch. He said it lightly in the way men say things about women when they think they are among other men, as though the subject is amusing. He asked how things were going with the mail order arrangement. He used the word arrangement in a way that made clear he considered it primarily as a transaction. And he said something about Nora being young, and he said it in a tone that Nora did not need to be any older to understand entirely. She heard Colt's voice. He said she is here to keep house and look after the children. That is the arrangement. When spring comes, if she wants to leave, she can leave. The man said something else, something she did not fully hear through the wall. Colt said that is all it is. She stood in the storage room with a jar of preserved plums in her hand and the wall solid between her and the back entry, and she thought about everything she had done in this house and everything she had been in this house, and she thought about Ivy saying Mama Nora with her small hands holding on and Levi's fingers closing around hers in the dark and the boot prints in the snow outside Clara's window, and she thought that is all it is. When spring comes, if she wants to leave, if. She put the plums back on the shelf. She did not go to supper. She went upstairs and she sat on the edge of her narrow bed and she thought for the first time in weeks clearly and without sentiment about the $14 in her shoe and the train that went east from Billings and the aunt in Cincinnati who had 6 children and a husband who had said he could not take on another mouth but might say something different if the mouth arrived with money and a willingness to work. She sat for a long time. Then she got paper and wrote a letter. She wrote, if I am only the arrangement, then I should release you from it. I came here without being asked, and I have stayed because I chose to, but choosing to stay in a place where you are not truly seen is a different thing from choosing to stay in a place where you are. And I am not sure anymore which of those things this is. She folded the letter and went downstairs and put it on the kitchen table beside the herbs she had set out for the following morning's broth. She put her coat on. She went out the back door into the snow. She was not thinking clearly about where she was going. She knew that even in the moment, she was thinking about air and cold and the feeling of moving, which was what she needed when the feeling of staying still was no longer bearable. The snow was heavy and the yard was dark beyond the lamp light from the kitchen windows, and she walked out past the garden fence and past the smokehouse and out into the open field following no particular direction, only away, and the cold received her without comment. She had been walking perhaps 20 minutes when she heard it, her name in Cal's voice. Not from behind her, from the house, high and thin in the cold air, carrying the particular frequency of a child who has understood that something is wrong and has not yet understood what. She stopped. She heard it again. Mama Nora. Higher now, frightened. She turned around. The kitchen light was visible from where she stood, a warm square in the dark, and in the doorway of the back entry, a small shape moved back and forth with the restless urgency of a child searching. She watched Cal stand in the doorway and call her name, and she thought, what are you doing? What are you doing out here in the snow when there are children in that house who have already lost one person they needed. She had been angry. She was still angry. The anger had not gone anywhere. But anger and responsibility occupy the same person without requiring that person to choose between them, and she had always known which one she was. She took a step back toward the house. Then she heard the other sound. Hoofbeats, moving fast through the field to her left. He found her standing in the open field 20 feet from where she had stopped, facing back toward the house. Colt pulled up and came off the horse in a single motion and crossed the distance between them and then stopped. He stopped perhaps 6 feet from her, close enough that she could see his face in the ambient light that the snow threw back from the sky. His breath made clouds in the cold air. He had come out without his hat. She said, "I heard Cal." He said, "I know. Bram is with him." She said, "I was coming back." He said, "I know that too." They stood in the field in the cold for a moment, and the snow came down around them, and the mountains were dark shapes in the darker sky. He said, "I said what I said because the man asking was not someone I trust, and because I have said certain things to myself for a long time about what is and is not possible in this house, and I have not yet found a way to unsay them." She waited. He said, "I have been telling myself since you arrived that this was temporary, that you would leave in the spring because everyone leaves, and because I am not the kind of man who asks anyone to stay, because I stopped being that kind of man 2 years ago." He stopped. He looked at the snow. He said, "And then you sat on the floor of Clara's room at 3 in the morning with my daughter in your arms, and you went to her grave and you spoke to her like she was still someone who deserved to be spoken to. And you stayed 4 nights beside my son when he could not wake up. And every time I found something to tell myself that explained it away, you did something else that I did not have an explanation for." The cold was very complete around them. She could feel it in her hands and her face. He said, "I do not know how to ask someone to stay. I have not done it. I am not sure I know the words for it. But I know that the letter you left on the table is the first thing that has frightened me in 2 years. That was not about my children, and I would like to ask you not to leave, if that is something you are willing to consider." She looked at him for a long moment. She said, "You told that man it was only an arrangement." He said, "I was wrong." 2 words, flat and certain, in the way that Cole Aldrich said flat. Certain things with no argument built around them and no qualification attached, just the plain fact. He was wrong. She looked at the snow on the ground between them, and then up at the mountains, and then back at him. She said, "I want to be seen. I want to be someone who is known here, not just used here. I want the children to know that I am not temporary. I want you to know that I am not temporary. If I stay, I am staying because this is my home, and I need you to treat it like that is true." He said, "I can do that." She said, "And I need you to mean it when you say it, not because a contract says it, because you do." He said, "I mean it." She believed him. She believed him not because she was naive or because hope had replaced her judgment, but because she had spent weeks learning to read the language. This man spoke, which was the language of action and consistency and the long, slow accumulation of evidence. And everything she had accumulated told her that when Colt Aldrich said a thing plainly, without the machinery of persuasion around it, he meant it. She said, "All right." She walked past him toward the horse, and he fell into step beside her, and they walked back across the field toward the house where the kitchen light was still burning, and Cal was still in the doorway watching. When they got close enough, Cal came off the porch and ran to her, and she caught him, and he pressed his face against her coat with a relief that had no room left for words. She held him until the relief subsided to something quieter. Then they went inside. The wedding was small. It was not a small thing, but it was a small ceremony, because neither of them had any interest in ceremony for its own sake. And both of them understood that what they were doing was not the ceremony, but the thing underneath the ceremony. The private decision two people make when they have looked at each other long enough and carefully enough and found that what they see is something they want to keep seeing. Reverend Marsh came out from Harlow Creek on a Tuesday morning in early April, when the snow had finally begun to mean it about leaving, and the first pale evidence of grass had appeared along the south fence. Agnes Corbett came her black coat freshly brushed and sat in the front room chair that Bram had moved to give her the best angle on the proceedings. Bram stood near the fireplace. Whit stood near the door. The three children stood together, Callan Ivy and Levi Ivy in the middle with her good dress on, and her hair that no one had ever entirely managed to subdue. She had tucked a small bunch of dried violet flowers into the sash at her waist, which she said were for Mama Clara, because Mama Nora had told her that Clara liked violets, and she thought Clara should have some at the wedding too. Nobody had told her to do that. She had decided it on her own. Nora stood at the front of the room in her navy traveling dress, the one she had worn on the train from Springfield, and the platform at Billings, in every significant moment since, because it was the dress she had arrived in, and she thought it was right to be married in it. Around the collar and the cuffs, a narrow band of white lace, small and careful and slightly imperfect at the join where it was sewn together. Whit had left it outside her door that morning with a note that said, "Mama used to say a bride needs something white. I've found lace in her trunk. I hope that is all right." She had stood in her room for a long moment holding the note. Then she had sewed the lace on herself quickly and carefully, and it had not been perfect, and it was all right. Colt stood at the front of the room and looked at her when she came down the stairs, and his face had the expression she had learned was his version of something he could not put words to, the slight shift in the eyes and the tightening along the jaw that meant he was feeling something larger than his usual register and was managing it the only way he knew how, by standing still and letting it move through him. Reverend Marsh said the words that needed to be said. When it came time for the ring, Colt reached into his coat pocket and produced something small. She had not known to expect this. He held it out to her, and she looked at it in his palm, a ring of hammered silver clearly made by hand, with a particular texture of something crafted by someone who was skilled with metal, but was doing this for the first time in this specific way. On the inside surface, she saw letters. She took it and turned it to read them. "Stay, I am asking." She looked up at him. He said nothing. He was very still. She put the ring on. She said, "I am staying." Agnes Corbett made a sound that was possibly a laugh and possibly something else. When the Reverend said they were finished, Levi stepped forward from the line of children. He had been standing straight throughout with the seriousness of someone who understood that this was an event with lasting implications and was treating it accordingly. He looked at Nora with his gray eyes, his father's eyes, and he said in the careful voice of an 8-year-old trying to say an adult thing correctly, "You look very fine, Mama Nora." It was the first time he had said it standing up and awake and looking directly at her. She crouched down and put her arms around him. He was stiff for a moment in the way that Levi was always stiff at first, and then he put his arms around her, and she felt him breathe. Behind her, Bram found something important to look at on the far wall. Whit turned toward the window. Agnes Corbett did not pretend at all and simply sat in her chair and let her eyes do what they were going to do. The morning came through the windows of the house and lay across the floor in long, pale strips, and outside the Gallatin Valley was beginning slowly, and with the particular deliberateness of high country, to remember that it knew how to be green. Year by year, season by season, in the way that good work accumulates without announcement, the years built themselves. The first spring, they planted the kitchen garden that Colt had said was not worth the effort and had fenced without being asked, and by July it had produced enough that Nora was putting up jars for the following winter, which was the point of a kitchen garden, as she explained to Colt with the patient reasonableness of someone who knew they were right. And he had looked at the jars on the shelf and nodded once in the way that constituted in his language an admission. The summer was long and the hay was good, and the brothers worked from before light until after dark through the cutting and the storing, and Nora cooked 3 meals a day for people who were hungry in the serious way that people are hungry when they have used their bodies completely, and she learned to scale the cooking to the scale of the labor, which was a different calculation from anything she had previously understood, and she got it wrong twice and then got it right and stayed right. Cal began to read with the focused pleasure of a person who has discovered that books are a country you can live in part of the time, and she fed this. She wrote to the bookstore in Bozeman and ordered things she thought he would want before he knew he wanted them. And she was right often enough that he began to trust her taste. And this became a conversation between them that did not require many words because it was conducted primarily through the exchange of objects. Ivy stopped being afraid of the dark. This happened in the second winter, gradually the fear resolving as the thing underneath it was slowly addressed. She began sleeping through the night without waking, and Nora noted this and said nothing about it because some improvements are made smaller by being remarked upon. Levi changed more slowly, but he changed. She watched it happen over the course of the first 2 years, the careful incremental opening of a person who had been protecting himself by being very still and who was discovering that the thing he had been protecting himself from had not materialized. She never pressed him. She remained consistent and present and let him set the pace, and he did. And by the end of the second year, he was talking to her in the kitchen in the evenings with the easy, half-distracted quality of someone who has stopped monitoring whether it is safe to talk. Bram got the apology right eventually. It took him most of a year, which was about how long it took Bram to do most things that required precision in the interior department. He said it plainly and without excess, and she received it the same way. After that, their relationship had the quality of two people who have settled an account and can proceed on level ground, and that suited them both. Wit stayed close in the way Wit always stayed close nearby, but not intruding present in the small and particular ways that mattered. He taught the Valley children wood carving in the summers. He continued to leave things outside her door on the appropriate occasions, a small figure of a horse. On the anniversary of the day she arrived, a bunch of dried wildflowers at Christmas once when she had been ill for a week in the second winter, a carved wooden cup that fit exactly in her hand left without comment. On the shelf in his workshop, the figure of the woman standing straight remained. The news of the first child came in the autumn of the second year, and Colt received it the way Colt received significant information in stillness, and then in a single gesture that said more than words. He had been standing by the kitchen window, and he turned and looked at her, and then he put both his hands over hers where they rested on the table, and he stood like that for a long moment, and she felt in the warmth and the weight of it, everything that he did not yet have the practice to say but was learning. Dr. Prentice delivered a girl in the deep of the second winter, and they named her Clara Ruth. Clara for the woman whose room Nora had sat in through 2 separate vigils, and whose grave she had knelt at in the cold and spoken to honestly, and Ruth because her father's favorite book had been Ruth, and she thought the sound of it was right for this particular child. This child born in a house that had been learning slowly and not without difficulty how to be a home again. Bram wept, which he would have denied, and everyone present knew better than to mention. Wit stood in the hall and turned the small, carved figure over in his hands. Cal sat on the stairs and received the news with the gravity of a boy who understood he had a sister, now and that this was a serious responsibility. Ivy was asleep and learned of Clara Ruth in the morning and said she can sleep in my room. Levi said she cannot sleep in your room. She is a baby, and you will keep her awake. This was the first complete and direct sentence Levi had spoken in Nora's presence, in which he had disagreed with someone about something trivial and done so without armor, the way you speak when you are safe enough not to need armor, and Nora heard it and thought, there it is. The second child came 2 years later, a boy, and they named him Elias after her father, and he came into the world with a crush so forceful that Wit downstairs looked up from his carving and said that one is going to have opinions. He was right. 23 years after the day Nora Whitfield stepped off the train at Billings with a carpet bag and a revolver and a contract she had not signed herself, Aldridge Ranch was a different place. Not different in its bones, the house was still the same 2 stories of heavy timber, still built to last, still squared to the mountain. The barn was larger now, and the south fence had been moved 3 times as the cattle operation grew. But the bones were the same bones, and anyone who had known the place in 1878 would have recognized it. What was different was harder to describe because it was not structural. It was the difference between a place where people survive and a place where people live, which is a difference of texture in sound, in the particular quality of the light inside the quality that comes from being inhabited by people who are most of the time glad to be where they are. Colt was 58. His hair had gone to silver at the temples and then spread from there, and he moved more carefully than he had, though no less effectively. He was still a man of few words, but the words he used had become over 20 years more precisely aimed, as though he had spent that time learning exactly which words to spend and had stopped wasting any. Each morning, without exception, he poured Nora's coffee before his own. She had never asked him to. He had never stopped. Bram had married in his 38th year, a widow from Harlow Creek with 2 children of her own, in a direct manner that matched his, and they had added 2 more, and the Bram Aldridge house was 5 miles down the valley and reliably the loudest place in the county at any holiday gathering. His forge had trained a generation of young men in the Gallatin Valley. He said this was practical and not sentimental. No one believed him. Whit had not married. He did not seem to need to. His workshop had become over the years something between a school and a sanctuary, the place where the children of the valley came to learn to make things with their hands and to sit in the particular quiet of a person who was genuinely at peace with being where he was. The carved figure of the woman standing straight had been replaced twice, each version more detailed than the last, and the current one stood on the highest shelf in the best light. Levi was 31 and managed most of the ranch operations, had married the previous year, in a ceremony held in the meadow behind the house on a day of brilliant June weather, and was already the kind of husband that Nora suspected his father had taken longer to become, which was his advantage and his inheritance, the thing you get when you grow up watching love practiced carefully by people who had to learn it. Cal was in Bozeman, a lawyer, which had surprised no one who had watched him read his way through the ranch's winters. He came home twice a year and brought books and talked to his mother about them in the kitchen until late in the evening. Ivy was teaching at the schoolhouse in Harlow Creek, and she talked as much as her father was quiet, which was considerable, and her students adored her without exception. She came home on Sundays. Clara Ruth was 19 with her grandmother's name and her mother's stubbornness and her father's eyes, and she had gone to visit relatives in Denver and had sent home 3 letters in 3 weeks that were primarily about a young man she had met at the post office. Colt had read these letters and handed them to Nora and said nothing. She had read them and handed them back. She said, "What do you think?" He said, "I think she will make up her own mind." She said, "You are not worried." He said, "I am always worried." But worrying is not the same as doubting. Elias was 17 and looked exactly like his father and argued about everything with the cheerful persistence of someone who had been told all his life that he had opinions and had taken this as a mandate. He was leaving for the university in the autumn, and the house was going to be quieter for it, and nobody in it was handling this equally well. On an evening in late September, when the light had turned the particular gold that September light turns in the high country, Nora stood on the front porch and looked out across the valley. The mountains were the same mountains. They had never been anything other than what they were: enormous and patient and entirely indifferent. And she had spent 23 years learning to find this quality, not threatening but restful, the way it is restful to stand beside something that has no need for you to be different from what you are. She heard the door behind her. Colt came out and stood beside her, and the evening settled around them the way it did when the day's work was finished, and there was nothing required of anyone for a little while. She said, "Do you remember the wagon?" He said, "Which part of it?" She said, "All of them." "Of it, 4 hours and nobody saying anything." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "I was thinking about whether you would last 2 weeks." She smiled. She said, "And now?" He looked out at the mountains for a moment. His voice, when it came, had the quality of something said once without drama, because it was simply the most accurate thing available. He said, "Now, I cannot remember what this place looked like before you were in it." From inside the house came the sound of Elias saying something with emphasis, and Ivy's voice responding with laughter, and somewhere beyond the barn, the low sound of cattle settling in the dusk. The smoke from the kitchen chimney went straight up into the still evening air, which meant no weather coming, which meant another quiet night. She put her hand at the crook of his arm, and he did not move away, and the valley lay before them in the last of the gold light, the same valley it had always been changed in all the ways that mattered. The mountains held them the way mountains hold everything without effort, without particular intention, simply by being what they are and staying where they are and letting the smaller things that live in their shadow do what smaller things do, which is to find each other and make something from the finding. This is what they had made. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was what the mountain keeps.